The first thing that caught the boy's eye that morning was the sound of nervous hooves dragging across the dusty ground. He had been to many auctions in his life, but something about this one felt different before it even began. Maybe it was the hushed murmurs in the crowd, or the way the handlers moved with a little more impatience than usual. People gathered near the wooden rails, whispering, trading opinions before the animals even stepped into the ring. Buyers inspected saddles, checked their pockets, and prepared their bids while the sun climbed higher, warming the smell of dirt and sweat. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, but the boy felt a quiet pull in his gut telling him it wasn't going to be one. He stood near the back, leaning against a post, watching each horse come through. Some were strong and proud, strutting as if they already knew the price they would fetch. Others seemed restless, ears flicking in every direction as the callers shouted the bids, but none of them caught his attention for long. He had come with his father mostly to observe, maybe help choose a young gelding for the next season's work. He wasn't expecting anything unusual, and he certainly wasn't expecting the moment that would change everything. It happened when the announcer paused for a breath and the handler stepped away from the gate. The next horse entered, and a noticeable shift rippled through the crowd. Instead of leaning forward with interest, buyers stepped back. A few lowered their hats to hide their smirks. Some shook their heads outright. The energy changed from eager anticipation to quiet judgment, the kind that carried more sting than words ever could. The horse was thin, unsteady on his legs, with his coat patchy and dull. His head hung low, and each step looked like it took more effort than the last. He wasn't old, but he carried the weight of a hard life on his back. Those closest to the rails didn't bother hiding their laughter. Someone called out that the handlers were wasting everyone's time. Another joked that the horse looked like he'd fall over before the bidding even reached the starting price. The boy felt a tightness in his chest as he watched the weak horse try to lift his head. There was something in the animal's eyes that didn't match the condition of his body. Something tired, yes, but also something waiting. The boy had seen many tired animals in his life, but very few with eyes that held that kind of spark still buried in them. It made him step a little closer without realizing it. The announcer attempted to begin the bidding. His voice carried the same trained confidence as always, but even he seemed uncertain as he waved his hand toward the horse. No one called out a number. The crowd stayed quiet, not with hesitation but with complete disinterest. The boy's father sighed, saying quietly that some horses came from situations too difficult to bounce back from. But the boy didn't look away. Then a rough laugh cut through the silence. One of the buyers near the front cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted that the horse wasn't even worth the rope he stood tied to. His remark triggered more laughter, louder this time. It rolled across the crowd, spreading like wildfire, feeding off the ease of mocking something too weak to defend itself. The horse flinched at the noise. His ears twitched, and he shifted his weight as though trying to brace himself. That small reaction made the boy's heart twist. He hated watching anyone being shamed, even an animal, especially an animal. The boy knew how unfair this world could be to anything or anyone who appeared weak. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, thinking the boy simply felt sorry, but what the boy felt ran deeper than pity. It felt like the horse was calling out silently for someone to see him beyond the broken shape he carried. Someone who could look past the bones showing under the skin, past the uneven steps, past the mockery. The announcer cleared his throat and tried again. He lowered the starting price, then lowered it once more, practically begging for even the smallest bid to keep the auction moving. Still, no one raised a hand. Buyers looked bored. Some wandered toward the water barrels, others studied the next set of horses in the pens. It was clear no one wanted him. The handlers began whispering to each other, moving their hands impatiently. One muttered that the horse should have never been brought in. Another grumbled that they should just lead him back out before he embarrassed them further. Yet the boy kept focusing on the horse's eyes. They were dull, yes, but beneath that dullness was a flicker, a quiet determination, a faint stubbornness, as though the horse still held some piece of himself tightly, refusing to let go no matter how rough life had treated him. The boy's father noticed the expression on his son's face and warned him gently not to get attached. He said some horses had stories too complicated to fix and that kindness alone wasn't always enough, But the boy didn't answer. His thoughts were tangled, full of questions. How had this horse ended up here in such shape? Who had let him come to this? And why did he feel as if the horse was trying to say something without a sound? The announcer finally sighed, wiping his brow with a cloth, and said they would have to move on. The handlers stepped toward the horse to lead him back out. One tugged the rope harder than needed, and the horse stumbled slightly. The crowd snickered again. The boy's jaw tightened. Before he could think, before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped forward and raised his hand. The movement froze the handlers, surprised the announcer, and silenced the crowd. His father stared at him, unsure if his son understood what he was doing. The announcer blinked, then pointed at the boy to confirm. The boy nodded once. The announcer repeated the boy's bid with a shaky voice, uncertain whether anyone else would challenge it. No one did. Instead, the buyers looked at the boy as if he had lost his mind. The boy didn't care. He kept his eyes on the horse. The announcer slammed the gavel lightly, declaring the horse sold. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was tense, puzzled, laced with whispered doubts. Some people muttered that the boy had wasted his money. Others said he would regret the decision before the day ended. A few snickered that not even the strongest man could turn that frail creature into anything worthwhile. The horse lifted his head slightly at the sound of the gavel, not understanding anything that happened, but sensing something had changed. The boy felt a strange weight settle over him. It wasn't regret, it was responsibility. A feeling that he had stepped into something far bigger than the moment suggested. As he walked toward the horse, people's chatter circled around him. Some scoffed. Some shook their heads. Some even laughed outright. But the closer he got, the more everything else faded. The horse watched him with a tired but curious gaze. The boy reached out and placed his hand gently on the horse's neck. The animal didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a slow breath, as if relieved someone finally touched him without force or dismissal. The boy felt the heat from his coat, the slight tremble in his muscles, and the fragile hope hiding beneath the exhaustion. His father approached, still concerned but not stopping him. He asked the boy if he understood what he had done. The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand it himself yet. He only knew that something about this horse wasn't ordinary. Something about him mattered. And as the handlers backed away and the crowd moved on to the next auction item, the boy noticed something strange. On the horse's flank, partially hidden under the rough coat, was a faint mark. It wasn't clear from a distance, but up close it looked almost like a symbol or brand. The boy frowned, brushing away some of the dirt to see it better, his breath caught. It wasn't just a random mark, it wasn't normal at all. And whatever it meant, it changed everything he thought he knew about the weak horse he had just bought. He swallowed hard, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. Because this horse, shamed by everyone there, carried a secret none of them had noticed. And that secret was only beginning to reveal itself. The sun eased lower behind the far hills, stretching long shadows across the ranch yard, as the man led the weak horse toward the open gate. Dust swirled around their feet, catching the fading light in a quiet shimmer. The horse moved slow, almost unsure of each step, as if the ground itself questioned whether he belonged on it. There was something fragile yet stubborn in the way he held his head, not proud but not defeated either. The man kept a calm hand on the rope, guiding him with patience instead of pressure. The weakness in the horse was clear, but there was also a spark under the rough surface, something not yet shaped or understood. Folks from the auction might have missed it, but the man had seen enough animals in his life to know when one wasn't finished. As they reached the small barn, a dog barked from somewhere behind the fence, the sound sharp in the stillness. The horse flinched, shifting sideways until he found the man's shoulder again. The man hushed him with a soft tone and eased him inside the stall. The place wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy, warm, and dry. Hay filled the corners, and the smell of worn timber hung in the air. Everything about it suggested quiet work instead of show. The horse lowered his head toward the fresh water, taking careful sips as if testing them first. The man leaned on the stall door, watching him drink with a thoughtful look. He didn't expect much, not yet, but he didn't expect failure either. Something about this horse pulled him in. The ranch itself sat on a gentle rise, open land stretching far in every direction. Fences rolled down the fields, breaking the land into grazing pastures. Most days were slow, filled with steady chores that trained a person to notice every small change in the animals. That's how the man had survived as long as he had. He wasn't rich, but he was patient, and patience often revealed what others rushed past. The week after the auction, he spent long hours working with the horse in quiet shifts. He didn't push him into anything, didn't ask for speed or strength. Instead, he watched the way the horse listened, the way he tried even when his legs trembled. There was a will buried under the weakness. Neighbors came by sometimes, leaning on the fence with curious smiles. They asked how long he planned on keeping a horse that looked like he should be resting somewhere else. Some even offered a few coins to take the horse off his hands, pretending to be doing him a favor. The man didn't argue. He just shook his head and went back to his work. Deep down, he knew this horse hadn't shown his true measure yet. He had seen the horse lift his head in moments of instinct, as if remembering what he used to be before life pushed him around. As days passed, the horse grew more alert. He still struggled, but now there was a steadiness in his steps. The man watched it with quiet satisfaction. He didn't tell anyone about the progress. Not the neighbors, not the traders who drove past, not even the few friends who asked him now and then if he needed help. He wanted the horse to grow without noise. The quiet was good for both of them. One evening, a horse trader rode through the area, stopping at the ranch for water. He spotted the weak horse near the corral and raised an eyebrow. He asked how much the man paid for him. The man answered simply. The trader let out a low whistle and said the horse was worth even less than that. He spoke about bloodlines and muscle tone, about how the animal would never be worth any real work. But the man just shrugged and kept brushing the horse's coat. The trader shook his head, muttering as he rode off. The man waited until he was out of earshot before smiling a little. Most people judged too fast. The horse continued to improve. His ribs didn't poke out as sharply, his eyes didn't seem as dull, and his steps didn't drag the way they had. Still, he wasn't fully steady. Some mornings he walked as if nothing could shake him, and then later he stumbled on soft ground. The man noticed each slip, each improvement, and quietly adjusted the training. There was no rush. He spoke to the horse often, even if the horse didn't understand the words. Animals could sense tone before meaning, and the tone he used was steady, encouraging. It made a difference. Late one afternoon, a storm rolled across the plains, bringing wind strong enough to rattle the barns. The horse panicked at first, backing deep into his stall as the sky cracked with lightning. The man stayed with him through the worst of it, talking in a low voice while the wind whipped around them. When the storm passed, the land felt washed and new. The horse's breathing slowed, and he leaned closer to the man as if grounding himself. For a brief moment, something changed in the horse's eyes. A small shift, but a real one, something like trust. Or maybe hope. The next morning, the horse walked out into the yard with more purpose. His legs still shook now and then, but he held himself differently. The man noticed and guided him toward the training pen. He started with simple steps, letting the horse circle him at a slow pace. The horse moved carefully but didn't waver. Each round grew smoother. A couple passing by on the road stopped to watch, whispering to each other. They remembered the horse from the auction and couldn't believe he was the same one. They asked the man what he planned to do with him. He only said he didn't know yet, and it was true. He didn't know. But he knew the horse had something inside him. A young helper from a nearby ranch dropped by later that day, saying he wanted to learn more about horses. He watched the man train the weak horse with fascination. He expected commands and force, but instead saw gentleness and small signals. The helper asked how the man knew the horse was worth saving. The man replied that sometimes the ones overlooked by everyone else were the ones who carried the strongest fire once they were given a chance. The helper thought about that long after he left. As weeks passed, news spread quietly among traders and ranchers that the weak horse hadn't given out. People grew curious. Some came with doubtful eyes, expecting to see a creature barely holding himself together. Instead, they found a horse building strength in measured steps. A few men joked that the man had wasted his time, saying the horse might walk better, but would never be more than a soft-hearted project. Their laughter didn't shake him. He heard the same kinds of words before, about other animals and even about himself when he was younger. Still, not all attention was friendly. A rancher known for his hard temper began stopping by too often, asking if the man was willing to sell before the horse broke down again. Something in his voice felt sharp, as if he didn't want the horse to succeed. The man refused each time. The rancher didn't like that. His last visit ended with him saying he would be back when the horse finally collapsed from weakness. The man didn't respond, but he kept an eye on him from that day on. Trouble had a way of returning. One late evening, the man walked the horse along the fence line. The air held a faint chill, and the sky glowed pale. The horse kept close to him, stepping with growing confidence. The man stopped near the far gate, studying the fields stretching beyond. Something was coming. He felt it in the quiet, in the way the wind shifted, in the way the horse lifted his head as if sensing it too. Change was near, and not the small kind. This horse, once shamed at the auction, was moving towards something bigger than either of them expected. What waited for them was still unclear, but the man knew the days ahead would test both his patience and the horse's spirit in ways neither had faced yet. And whatever was coming would force the horse to show exactly what he was made of, whether the world was ready to see it or not. The next few days carried a weight in the air that the man couldn't quite explain. It wasn't fear, at least not in the usual sense. It was more like a quiet warning hanging over the ranch, something that made him glance toward the road more than usual. The weak horse sensed it too. He had begun to pick up on every change in the man's posture, responding with small shifts of his own. When the man paused, the horse paused. When the man turned sharply, the horse's ears flicked as if catching the same sound. They were learning each other through small moments, and those moments built something steady between them. Still, the tension around them grew. Word had spread far beyond the nearby ranches. People liked stories of impossible turnarounds, even if they didn't believe them. By the end of the week, a couple of travelers stopped by, curious to see the horse for themselves. They leaned on the fence and studied him with raised brows, whispering to each other about how he might still collapse or give out. They questioned the man in a tone that made it clear they weren't here to admire anything. They wanted to prove their doubts right. But the horse didn't break under their stare. He stood still, calm, watching them with a steady eye. There was a quiet strength building in him, even if it wasn't fully shaped yet. The man continued training early each morning before the sun warmed the ground. He guided the horse through slow circles, careful steps, and short trots. Each movement was measured. The horse's body still trembled sometimes, especially when turning on uneven soil, but now he pushed through the tremble instead of giving up. The man noticed that determination and felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just training anymore. It was hope that made him more protective than he expected. But trouble always found its way back. One afternoon, the hard-tempered rancher returned, riding up to the fence with a sharp clip of hooves. His eyes went straight to the horse, narrowing in a way that made the man's stomach tighten. The rancher made another offer, bigger than the last one. Too large for someone who supposedly didn't value the horse. That alone made the man suspicious. When the man refused again, the rancher's smile faded. He said the horse would never last through real work, and that the man was wasting time. The man didn't answer, and the rancher rode off with a glare that lingered longer than his shadow. Later that evening, the young helper returned to the ranch, carrying a sack of oats as a gift. He asked if he could watch the training again. The man agreed. As they worked in the pen, the helper spoke about the rancher with the hard temper. He said the man owned a large piece of land and didn't like when others outshined him. Rumor was he'd been trying to acquire more horses for some upcoming event, something competitive. The helper didn't know the details, but he said the rancher had been getting irritated lately, snapping at his workers. The man listened quietly. It explained the rancher's strange interest. The subplots deepened as the days passed. The helper kept coming by, each time more invested in the story unfolding before him. He wasn't there just to watch a weak horse grow stronger. He was learning something about patience, trust, and the value of quiet work. Sometimes he shared stories of his own struggles on his ranch, how he felt overlooked and underestimated. The man recognized that feeling. The horse did too. Maybe that was why the helper felt drawn to them. They were all trying to prove something, though none of them said it aloud. Meanwhile, the travelers who had visited earlier returned with a friend, this time carrying a small camera. They wanted to film the horse, hoping to capture a moment that would bring attention to their trading business. The man refused. He didn't want the horse turned into a show before he was ready. The travelers left annoyed, whispering about how stubborn the man was. Their frustration added more tension to the days ahead. People wanted a story before it was finished, and the man wasn't willing to let that happen. Things shifted further when the weather turned unexpectedly colder. The weak horse struggled with the chill, and the man had to adjust his training. Some mornings, the horse seemed strong, ready to push forward. Other mornings, he walked stiffly, his breath fogging in the air as his muscles strained to warm up. The man stayed patient, giving him time to adjust. But the inconsistency made him worry. He feared the rancher might return at the wrong moment and use the weakness as proof that the horse would never be more than an auction reject. One night, the wind rattled the windows and the man woke with a strange feeling. He went out with a lantern, checking the barn and fences. Everything was in place. The horse slept quietly, his breathing slow and steady. But on the far side of the gate, near the fence line, the man noticed boot prints in the dirt, fresh ones. Someone had been there recently, watching the ranch while everyone slept. The man's jaw tightened. He didn't need to guess who it might be. The next morning, he worked with the horse in the training pen, his eyes drifting toward the road every few minutes. The horse sensed the change and became alert, ears flicking toward every small sound. The tension settled between them like dust on a dry day. The man tried to keep his movements calm, but his thoughts were racing. Someone wanted something from the horse, and whatever it wasn't good. A few days later, an invitation arrived from a nearby rancher known for hosting community events. It mentioned a small local show, mostly meant for fun, but sometimes attended by folks who wanted to display their horses. The letter invited the man to bring any horse he wanted. The timing felt odd. He hadn't been part of any event in years. Why now? When he folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket, he noticed the weak horse watching him from across the yard. The horse's gaze held a question inside it, though it didn't need words. The man didn't answer out loud. He wasn't sure he had one. The invitation sparked gossip among neighbors. Some thought the man would embarrass himself if he brought the weak horse. Others whispered that the rancher with the hard temper might be behind the invitation, hoping to expose the horse's remaining flaws in front of everyone. If the horse stumbled or hesitated, the ridicule would spread across the region fast. The man didn't like the idea, but he also didn't want to hide forever. The horse deserved a chance to stand in public, even if only to show he wasn't what people thought. But before he could make any decision, another subplot rose quietly. A woman from a distant ranch stopped by, saying she'd heard rumors about a horse that refused to give up. Her own ranch struggled with sick animals, and she asked the man how he helped the weak horse regain trust and strength. The man shared a few simple ideas, explaining that patience mattered more than pressure. She thanked him with a grateful smile and left. Her visit reminded him that stories traveled in unexpected ways, reaching places he didn't even imagine. Yet the deeper conflict remained untouched. The rancher with the sharp temper still hovered like a threat. The travelers might return with more cameras. The event invitation sat in the man's pocket, growing heavier each day. And the horse, though stronger, still carried shadows from his past. There were moments when his legs faltered without warning, as if reminders of what he once was tried to pull him back. The man noticed every slip, every hesitation, and it built tension inside him. He needed the horse to be ready when trouble finally stepped through the gate, but he couldn't rush the process. One evening, as the sky darkened, the man led the horse to the far pasture. The wind carried a quiet hiss across the fields, and the grass swayed like moving shadows. The horse stood beside him, calm but alert. The man rested his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the steady beat under the skin. The bond between them had grown, stronger than anything he expected. But bonds didn't erase danger. They only made the stakes higher. Something was coming. The man could feel it pressing toward them from all directions, carried by whispers, rumors, and the weight of envy. The weak horse, once shamed at the auction, was no longer invisible. And the more visible he became, the more the world around them tightened. The next chapter of their story wasn't going to be quiet. It wasn't going to be easy. But the man knew one thing for certain as he stood beside the horse in the growing dark. Whatever storm waited ahead, they would face it together. The days that followed felt like the long stretch of sky before a storm, when everything grows still but the air carries a strange pull. The man sensed it every time he stepped outside. Even the weak horse felt it, lifting his head at sounds that normally wouldn't bother him. Something was closing in on them, and neither of them knew what shape it would take. They only knew it was coming. Training grew more intense, though the man never pushed the horse past his limit. He shifted their work to different parts of the ranch, testing how the horse reacted to uneven ground, narrow spaces, open fields, and sudden commands. The horse responded with a steady mix of caution and courage. Some moments showed real strength, sharper and more confident than ever. Other moments revealed traces of his past weakness, reminding the man that progress wasn't a straight line. Still, the horse moved with more heart than any animal the man had ever seen. That alone made him worth protecting. The rumors around the ranch thickened. The travelers who had tried to film the horse earlier were now telling people in nearby towns that the weak auction horse was being trained for some special event. They painted the story in a way that made it sound almost unbelievable. Some mocked it, saying no amount of training could change a horse born without strength. Others grew curious and wanted to see the horse for themselves. A few even rode by the ranch but didn't approach, choosing instead to spy from a distance. The man noticed this strange attention each time he looked toward the road. Riders would slow down, glance toward the fence, and then continue on. It made the man feel watched. It also made him more careful about which parts of the ranch he used for training. He didn't want outsiders studying the horse too closely before the horse was ready to face the world. The hard-tempered rancher made no appearance for over a week, which only increased the tension. The man knew silence didn't mean surrender. It usually meant planning. And whatever the rancher was planning, it wouldn't be simple. His kind didn't give up their grudges quietly. One afternoon, the young helper came by again, his face worried. He said he had overheard something at the supply store. The rancher with the temper had been talking loudly about an upcoming competition, claiming he would be bringing the finest horses in the region. He also said he hoped certain people would attend so they could see what a real horse looked like. He didn't mention names, but everyone knew who he meant. The helper said the rancher seemed confident, almost too confident, like he already knew how things would unfold. The man kept his voice calm when he thanked the helper, but inside he felt the tension tighten. He didn't like the idea of being baited. He didn't like that the rancher was making plans that involved them, plans he wasn't sharing openly. The man folded the information away in his mind and went back to training with a sharper focus. As days went on, the horse grew better at reading the man's cues. He understood pressure, release, and direction with simple shifts of weight or hand movement. He was still thin, still not as powerful as other horses, but the way he moved now carried purpose. His confidence wasn't loud. It was quiet and steady, the kind that lasted longer. The man knew the horse wasn't ready for anything chaotic yet, but life had its own timing. One late afternoon, while the man was working with the horse in the large pasture, a sudden shot rang out in the distance. Not a shot meant to kill, just one fired into the air. The sound echoed across the land, sharp enough to startle any living thing. The horse jerked, legs tensing, eyes wide. But instead of bolting or collapsing, he stood frozen, searching for the source. The man steadied him with a hand on his neck. His own heart raced, but he kept his voice calm. The sound came again, louder this time. And then the man saw the dust rising near the far fence line. Someone on horseback was riding past, firing into the air as if testing reactions. It was a reckless show, meant to provoke. The man recognized the rider's posture even from a distance. It was the rancher with the temper. He didn't stop or approach. He just rode by with a smirk on his face, disappearing down the road. The message was clear. He was reminding the man that he could appear whenever he wished. He was reminding him of the difference in power. The man stood beside the horse until the dust settled, breathing in a slow rhythm until the horse relaxed again. After that incident, the man made changes. He moved the horse into the barn at night instead of letting him stay in the pasture. He checked the locks twice before sleeping. He even built a temporary barrier inside the barn to keep the horse safer. The helper noticed the changes during his next visit and asked if something had happened. The man didn't share details, but the helper sensed enough to understand that things were escalating. The invitation to the community event still sat on the man's table, but he hadn't answered it. People in town started asking whether he would bring the weak horse. Some were curious, some doubtful, some plainly amused. The man understood what the event represented. It wasn't just a chance to show the horse. It was a stage where everyone could judge them without knowing the journey. If the horse showed weakness, the crowd would eat it up. And if he showed strength, the rancher with the temper wouldn't let that glory last long. Yet the horse had come too far to stay hidden. The man knew this deep down, even if he didn't want to admit it yet. Tension built in the smallest places. A broken gate latch that shouldn't have been loose. A set of boot prints leading up to the barn that didn't match his or the helper's. A rope left coiled in the wrong place. Nothing that proved anything, but everything that pointed toward someone watching, someone waiting. One night, the man heard something unusual. A faint clink of metal near the barn, too soft to be a horse shifting, too sharp to be wind. He grabbed his lantern and stepped outside. The air felt heavy. He walked toward the barn with slow steps, keeping the light low. The horse inside shifted and snorted, sensing the tension. When the man rounded the corner, he saw a dark figure slipping away from the barn door. He called out, but the figure didn't turn. It ran. The man chased for several steps, but the night swallowed the intruder too quickly. He returned to the barn, checking everything. Nothing was broken, nothing was missing. But the security he had built around the horse now felt paper thin. The next morning he found scratches on the barn door. Not claw marks, tool marks. Someone had tried to pry it open. The tension grew into something that weighed on him every time he stepped outside. Even the helper noticed the change and asked if there was anything more he could do. The man shook his head and said he would handle it, but he wasn't sure how. The horse sensed everything. He watched the man closely, mirroring his emotions. When the man was tense, the horse held his breath longer. When the man relaxed, the horse's ears softened. Their bond grew deeper, shaped by the challenges around them. One morning, a letter arrived with no sender written on it. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, as if someone didn't want to stay in one spot for long. It said the community event had moved to an even larger gathering ground. More ranchers would be attending, more buyers, more trainers. It was going to be the biggest event in years. The man read the letter twice. His hand tightened on the paper. Someone wanted him there. Someone wanted the horse to stand in front of everyone. Whether it was for good or for harm, he couldn't tell. As the event drew near, the air around the ranch grew thicker. The horse trained harder, the man slept less. The helper worried more, rumors spread faster. And far beyond the hills, people were already placing bets on what might happen. The tension built like a storm creeping toward the ranch, slow but unstoppable. The man knew they were reaching the edge of something, a point where everything would come to a head. A moment where the weak horse, once shamed at the auction, would face the world that doubted him. But he also knew the rancher with the temper was preparing for the same moment, ready to strike in whatever way caused the most damage. The stage was forming, piece by piece, and every sign pointed toward a confrontation no one could avoid. The man stood beside the horse that evening, his hand resting on the warm coat, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath. The wind carried silence across the fields, the kind that comes before everything breaks open. Whatever happened next would shape everything that followed. In the quiet that followed the tense moment, it felt as if the world had paused to catch its breath. The storm outside had finally settled, leaving the air cool and heavy with the smell of wet earth. Inside, everyone seemed frozen between relief and lingering fear, unsure of what would come next. The tension had been so strong that even now, long after the danger had slowed, their hearts beat with the memory of it. No one spoke at first. They all just stood there, trying to understand what they had witnessed and what it meant for their future. Slowly, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle. The main conflict that had pushed them all to their limits finally had a shape they could understand. After all the confusion and doubt, the truth was no longer blurry. It was real and clear enough to face. Even though the outcome was not completely known yet, the path forward had opened. They could feel it in the way their breath steadied and their shoulders loosened. For the first time in a long while, hope felt close enough to touch. The characters moved back into the room where everything had started. The space felt different now. The shadows seemed less threatening. The silence felt calmer. Even the walls, which once felt too tight and unforgiving, now seemed to hold warmth and safety. It was as if the place itself had taken a deep breath along with them. They gathered near the center, exchanging glances that carried both exhaustion and gratitude. Nothing needed to be said. The bond between them spoke louder than any words could. But the story was not finished. The climax had shaken them deeply, and now the resolution had to bring them back into themselves. Each character had something unsaid, something they carried silently throughout the journey. Now those thoughts and feelings were ready to surface. The conflicts that once pulled them apart had shifted. Instead of dividing them, the challenges had reminded them of how important they were to one another. The way forward would not erase the past, but it would make the future easier to face. One by one, they began to reflect on what the struggle had cost them and what they had gained. There had been fear, doubt, and moments when everything felt lost. Yet through all of that, they had discovered strength in places they never expected. They had uncovered truths that would stay with them forever. The transformation in each of them was quiet but powerful. It showed in the way they stood, the way they breathed, and the way they looked at one another. As they spoke, their voices were softer than before, touched with honesty. They shared what they had learned through the experience. They spoke about courage that only appeared when fear was strongest. They spoke about trust that grew even when the world around them felt uncertain. They spoke about hope that refused to fade, no matter how dark things seemed. Their words filled the room with a calm sincerity that wrapped around them like a warm blanket. There had been moments during their journey when it felt like everything might break. Each challenge had pushed them close to the edge, forcing them to confront things they had avoided for years. Some learned to face their pasts. Others learned to open their hearts. And some discovered that they were stronger than they ever believed. The emotional weight of the journey had changed them forever, not in loud or dramatic ways, but in the quiet, lasting ways that matter most. Outside, the sky slowly brightened as the day began to break. Soft light filtered through the windows, painting the room with pale gold. It was the kind of morning that promised peace after a long night. They all turned toward the light, as if drawn by the idea of a fresh start. The atmosphere felt lighter, almost peaceful. Nature itself seemed to whisper that the worst was behind them. The story, which had been filled with tension and uncertainty, was now ready to settle into its final chapters. They began to take small steps to put everything back in order. Simple actions like cleaning the space, fixing what had been damaged, and returning items to their places felt symbolic. Every movement represented healing, understanding, and closure. It was not just the environment they were restoring, but themselves. The act of setting things right softened the emotional edges left from the climax. As they worked, conversations flowed naturally. They spoke about moments that frightened them and moments that inspired them. They shared memories from earlier parts of their journey that suddenly made more sense now. There was laughter here, the kind that appears gently after long periods of stress. It was a sign that their spirits were settling, that they were finding their balance again. The subplots that had woven through their adventure also found their resolutions. Relationships that had been strained began to mend. Understanding replaced old conflicts. Misunderstandings were cleared, promises were renewed. Even the characters who had felt lost finally found clarity. Every loose thread seemed to find its place, weaving back into the larger picture of their shared experience. One character took a moment to step outside alone, letting the fresh air touch their face. The world looked different now. The fear that once hung in the air like mist had lifted. Birds had returned, singing softly in the early light. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of the earth after rain. The quiet outside mirrored the calm within. This moment alone allowed them to reflect deeply on everything that had happened. They realized that despite the chaos, they had grown into someone stronger, someone more aware, someone more prepared for whatever life would bring next. When they returned inside, the others welcomed them with warm smiles. No one needed to explain anything. They were all on the same page, sharing the same relief and the same sense of completion. They knew the time had come to let the story settle into its final moments. There were no more hidden threats or unanswered mysteries waiting to jump out. What remained now were reflections and the comforting knowledge that they had made it through together. As they prepared to part ways, there was a sense of peace in the air. They exchanged final thoughts, each one focused on gratitude and understanding. They spoke about how this experience had changed them and what they hoped to carry into the future. The keywords of hope, unity, courage, truth, and transformation felt natural in their conversations because they had lived through those ideas firsthand. Their journey had been difficult, but it had shaped them into better versions of themselves. When the time came to say goodbye, it was not a sad moment. It was gentle, filled with appreciation and respect. They knew that even though they were going separate ways, the bonds they had created would remain with them. Every step forward would carry the memory of everything they had survived together. The ending did not feel like a conclusion, but a new beginning built on everything they had learned. As each character walked away, the world around them seemed brighter, calmer, and full of promise. The conflicts had been resolved, the questions answered, and the emotions settled. What remained was wisdom and a quiet strength that would guide them in the days ahead. Their story had come to a natural end, leaving behind a message of resilience, understanding, and the power of facing challenges with unity and courage. And so, the tale gently closed, not with dramatic flair, but with the steady warmth of peaceful resolution. It left behind a sense of meaning and a reminder that even the darkest moments can lead to growth and light when faced with heart and hope.